On the day his own son spat the words, "Find somewhere else to die," Thomas stuffed his life into 2 suitcases and walked out of the house he had built with 40 years of sacrifice. The humiliation burned deeper than the grief of losing his wife, and in that moment he believed everything was gone. But 3 days later, in the quiet of a lawyer's office, a revelation shattered the lies and turned despair into a storm of reckoning. His late wife had left a secret plan, one that would change everything. Subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because what comes next will leave you stunned. Thomas had just buried his wife of 40 years, and when the last of the mourners had left and the flowers on the casket began to wither, he returned to a house that felt like a tomb with the lights still on. Every room carried the echo of laughter, the smell of Sunday roasts, the faint trace of perfume on the dresser she had used each morning. He stood in the doorway of their bedroom longer than he could bear, staring at the indent in the mattress where she used to sleep, and then closed the door as if shutting out the sight would dull the ache. The house, once alive with holidays, birthdays, and the rhythms of shared life, was silent now, an emptiness so heavy it pressed against his chest until his breath came in shallow bursts. He told himself he was not completely alone. He had Michael, his son, his blood. That thought was the thin thread he clung to, convincing himself that even if the world had ripped away his partner, at least the bond between father and son would hold. Michael began appearing at the house with a smile practiced to look gentle, bringing his wife Julia along. They carried pamphlets for retirement communities and spoke in voices laced with false warmth, calling them opportunities, not endings. Thomas listened, polite, though the words tasted sour in his mouth. Julia would place a hand on his arm and say he deserved to relax, to have company his own age, to let go of the burden of a house too big for him. Michael would nod, adding that it was for the best, that he would always be nearby, that this was about care. Thomas heard the words, but underneath them was a hum, a vibration of calculation that made him uneasy. Still, he tried to believe, tried to ignore the tightness in his gut that told him something darker was moving behind their eyes. At night, when he sat in the living room surrounded by framed photos, Michael in his baseball uniform, his wife smiling in the garden, the family gathered around a Christmas tree, Thomas let himself cry, not with loud sobs, but with the quiet tears of a man who had always been taught to stay strong. He told himself Michael would not abandon him, not after all the years of scraped knees tended, homework checked, sacrifices made. He remembered the nights he had worked double shifts so Michael could go to college, the mornings he had risen before dawn to make sure there was food on the table. That kind of devotion had to mean something. Surely, he thought, grief was making him suspicious, seeing shadows where none existed. The cracks widened slowly. Michael began dropping by less to reminisce and more to ask about bills, about bank accounts, about the upkeep of the house. Julia spoke of market values, of how much they could get if the house was sold. Thomas brushed it off as idle talk, convinced himself that it was just their way of trying to ease his burden. But each conversation left a bruise. Each word chipped away at the fragile hope that they cared about him more than what he owned. One evening, Michael arrived with 2 suitcases. Julia followed, her heels clicking across the floor that Thomas's wife had polished every spring. The air felt colder, though the heat was on. Michael cleared his throat, his voice steady in a way that chilled Thomas more than if it had cracked. He said they had made a decision, that Julia's promotion meant they needed to move into town, that the house was perfect for them. Thomas stared, struggling to comprehend. This was his home, the place where he had carried his wife over the threshold, the place where Michael had taken his first steps. His lips parted, but before words could come, Michael's expression hardened. He said it plainly, with the kind of finality that leaves no air for argument. The will left everything to him, the house, the investments, all of it. The floor seemed to tilt. Thomas gripped the back of a chair to steady himself. He whispered that there must be a mistake. But Michael's mask slipped for a moment, revealing calculation as sharp as broken glass. He said their father had known he would take better care of the legacy, that Thomas was just a man who never understood money, just a man who had worked with his hands and provided but never truly built. Just the husband, just the father, reduced to those words, like an afterthought. And then came the final blow, delivered with the kind of coldness only betrayal can carry. Michael told him to find somewhere else to die, because he was useless now. Thomas packed his life into 2 suitcases, the walls of the house watching silently as he folded shirts that still smelled faintly of his wife's fabric softener. Julia stood by the doorway, checking her watch as if he were late for a train. Michael didn't look him in the eye. When the bags were in the trunk, Julia pressed $200 into his palm, like a tip left on a diner table. They spoke of independence, of freedom, as if discarding him were an act of kindness. The drive to the motel was a blur. The sun set in, with its thin towels and faded carpet, became his exile. He sat on the sagging bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to absorb the reality that in the span of a single evening, he had gone from a grieving widower to a man discarded like worn shoes. But as the hum of traffic seeped through the thin walls and the neon sign outside flickered, another thought began to form. Michael's words replayed in his head, each syllable cutting deeper. But beneath the pain, there was a spark. His wife, meticulous in everything, had once shown him papers, had once spoken of making sure he was protected. Could it be that Michael's story was nothing but a lie? The memory of her voice, gentle yet firm, urged him not to give in. He clenched his fists, the sorrow in his chest beginning to twist into something sharper. He told himself he would find the truth, and when he did, Michael would learn that betrayal carries a cost. And it was in that motel room, with the wallpaper peeling and the scent of disinfectant clinging to the air, that Thomas felt the shift. He was no longer the broken man cast aside. He was a husband who remembered every promise his wife had ever made. And he was a father who had just been pushed too far. The grief had hollowed him. But in that hollow space, something new was rising. Something his son was not prepared to face. Because the truth was waiting, and once uncovered, it would not only turn the tables, but set fire to everything Michael thought he had won. And when that fire burned, Thomas would be standing at the center, not as a victim, but as the man who refused to die quietly. Would you like me to continue the next part of the story in the same cinematic style, moving into the lawyer's office discovery scene, so the flow remains seamless? Michael began appearing at the house more frequently, never alone, always with Julia at his side, the sound of her heels clicking across the hardwood floor like punctuation marks to every false smile. They brought pamphlets neatly folded, glossy photos of retirement communities that promised walking trails, game nights, and smiling faces of people who looked far too cheerful to be real. They spoke of simplifying life, of companionship with others his age, of letting go of responsibilities that were supposedly too much for him now. Their words dripped with concern, sweet on the surface. Yet beneath the syrup, Thomas could hear the grind of machinery, the gears of calculation turning with every suggestion. He listened in silence, nodding occasionally, his face unreadable. But inside he felt the first stirrings of unease, like a draft seeping through cracks in a wall that once felt solid. Julia was always the more polished one, her sentences crafted with care, her tone rehearsed. She would sit on the edge of his couch, legs crossed neatly, speaking as though she were presenting to a boardroom. She said things like, "You've done enough. You've carried the weight for so long. You deserve peace now." It should have sounded like compassion, but Thomas felt the sharp edges hidden in her delivery. It wasn't peace she wanted for him. It was possession. He could see it in the way her eyes swept across the living room, pausing at the framed photographs, the antique clock his wife had cherished, the shelves lined with books marked by decades of use. Julia was measuring the space as if it already belonged to her. Michael, for his part, played the role of dutiful son with a performance that might have fooled a stranger. He placed a hand on his father's shoulder, called him Dad in a softer tone than usual, and assured him this was for the best. But Thomas could still hear the boy who once demanded new shoes for basketball, while Thomas worked double shifts to afford them. That sense of entitlement hadn't vanished. It had matured into something colder, more dangerous. The concern in Michael's voice was too even, too rehearsed, like lines read from a script. At night, Thomas replayed their visits in his mind. Alone in the quiet of the house, he would hear Julia's carefully chosen words echo against the walls. Activities for your age. Less responsibility. Perfect for someone in your situation. The phrases felt less like offers and more like verdicts. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from him where his wife once sipped tea, and whispered to himself that he wasn't imagining it. She had known their son better than anyone. She had warned, in her own quiet way, that Michael's ambition could turn cruel if unchecked. He remembered her voice, soft but steady, telling him never to let go of what they had built together. One afternoon, Julia arrived alone, carrying a pie from the bakery downtown, her smile wide but brittle. She set it on the counter and began talking about how lovely the community on Maple Street was, how the apartments had brand new kitchens, and how the staff were like family. Her words were filled with warmth, yet her eyes betrayed impatience, darting toward the staircase, toward the rooms she seemed to already envision as hers. Thomas offered her coffee, watched her fingers tap nervously on the mug, and felt the unease crystallize into suspicion. They were circling him, soft voices masking sharp intentions, but the truth was starting to bleed through. When Michael came by later that week, Thomas asked him directly, "What's wrong with this house?" Michael froze, then forced a chuckle, brushing off the question as if it were silly. He said nothing was wrong, but wouldn't it be better to be somewhere with less burden, less space to manage? His voice cracked slightly when he said the word burden. It was there, hidden but undeniable. The truth that his father was no longer seen as a man, but as an obstacle standing in the way of their plans. The memories of his wife weighed heavily on Thomas each time they spoke of selling, of moving, of letting go. He thought of the garden she had tended with care, the rosemary bushes she clipped for Sunday roasts, the lemon tree she had loved to see in bloom. These were not just things. They were her fingerprints still pressed into the earth. To leave them behind would be to abandon her all over again, and that was something he could not do. Yet he stayed quiet, listening, watching, as his son and daughter-in-law tightened their net. The tension deepened when Julia began speaking of finances, dropping comments about how much the property was worth, how it could be an opportunity for everyone. Thomas heard the shift in her language. It was no longer about his comfort, but about value, about assets, about what could be gained if he stepped aside. He kept his expression calm, his replies measured, but his mind was already sketching out the shape of their ambition. He saw the gleam in Julia's eyes when she mentioned renovations, the way Michael's jaw tightened when he spoke of tuition bills and new investments. They weren't waiting for his blessing. They were laying the groundwork to take what wasn't theirs. The nights grew longer as the weight of suspicion settled into his bones. He walked through the house in silence, trailing his fingers along the photographs on the walls, the furniture worn smooth by decades of use. He whispered his wife's name into the empty rooms, asking for strength, asking for clarity. He could almost hear her answer in the creak of the floors, in the whisper of the wind through the trees outside. She had always been practical, always one step ahead. If she were here, she would tell him to look closer, to trust what he saw beneath the smiles. Each visit from Michael and Julia confirmed what Thomas already knew in his gut. Their voices grew more insistent, their smiles thinner, their patience shorter. They brought contractors by under the guise of helping with repairs. But Thomas noticed the way they asked about measurements, about timelines, about potential upgrades. They were planning as though he had already been erased from the picture. He remained quiet, but the silence was no longer born of grief. It was a silence sharpened by awareness, by the knowledge that they thought him blind. He began writing notes in a small notebook he kept hidden in the drawer of his desk. Dates, comments, the names of the communities they mentioned, the phrases they used. Simplifying life, peace of mind, financial opportunity. He wrote them down one by one, like evidence in a trial he knew was coming. Each word was a thread, and together they wove a web of intent so clear it could no longer be denied. Thomas carried the notebook with him, tucked inside his jacket pocket, a quiet shield against their deceit. The weight of it reminded him that he wasn't powerless, that even as they whispered about his decline, he was still a man capable of seeing, of remembering, of fighting back when the time came. One evening after they left, Thomas stood in the hallway, the house dark except for a single lamp by the window. He opened the notebook and read the lines he had written, his hand trembling not from weakness, but from the clarity of truth. They were waiting for him to falter, to break, to give up. But grief had sharpened his vision instead of blinding it. The unease that had begun as a draft of suspicion was now a storm gathering inside him. He looked around at the rooms filled with his wife's memory, at the walls that had held their life together, and he made a vow in the silence. He would not be erased. He would not be shuffled off to a place chosen for their convenience. And as he closed the notebook and set it gently on the table, a thought cut through the shadows with the sharpness of a blade. If they believed they had already won, they were about to discover just how dangerous it is to underestimate a man who has nothing left to lose. One evening the door swung open, and Michael stepped inside with Julia close behind him, both of them carrying suitcases as if they were arriving at a hotel that had already been reserved in their names. The sound of the bag scraping across the hardwood floor was louder than it should have been, sharp and final, like a gavel striking down. Thomas looked up from his chair, confusion tightening around his chest. Before he could ask a single question, Michael's mouth curved into a smirk that carried no warmth, only cold certainty. He said the words like a verdict. "Dad, Mom left everything to me. The house, the accounts, all of it. You need to move out." For a moment, Thomas thought he had misheard, that his grief was twisting sound into cruelty. But the look in his son's eyes was clear. There was no mistake. 40 years of sacrifice, of sweat on his brow, of nights spent working double shifts so Michael could wear decent clothes to school, so he could go to college without debt, were being swept aside as though they meant nothing. His throat tightened. He froze in his chair, unable to move, staring at the boy he had raised and seeing a stranger in his place. Julia placed her suitcase against the wall and folded her arms, her posture smug, as if this moment had been rehearsed. Her gaze darted around the room, taking in the furniture, the photographs, the familiar walls she clearly already considered her own. She didn't bother with the mask of concern anymore. Her smile was thin and sharp, her silence as loud as Michael's words. Thomas's lips parted, his voice cracking as he asked if there had been some kind of mistake, if Michael had misunderstood, if this was some grotesque joke in the middle of his grief. But Michael's face hardened, and his eyes glinted with that cruel satisfaction Thomas had seen before. When his son was a teenager getting away with something he knew was wrong, he shook his head slowly, savoring the moment, and repeated that it was all his now. Every account, every asset, every memory contained within the walls of this house. The blow landed deeper than Thomas could admit aloud. His mind reeled back to the nights when his wife would sit at the kitchen table, carefully balancing the checkbook, reminding him that their son deserved the best they could give. He remembered nodding, agreeing, working harder, giving more, believing it would matter in the end. Now all of it was being dismissed with a smirk and a suitcase. He rose from the chair on trembling legs, his hands curling into fists, though he kept them at his sides. His voice was low, measured, a desperate attempt at reason. He told Michael this was his home, the place where he and his wife had built a life together, where Michael himself had taken his first steps, where every corner still echoed with her memory. Michael shrugged, the gesture casual, careless, as if the past were dust that could be brushed away with one sweep of his hand. Julia finally spoke, her tone brisk, businesslike, saying that it was time to think about the future, that it was better for everyone if Thomas moved into a place more suited to his age. Her eyes slid over him as though he were a piece of furniture that no longer fit the style of the house. She added that they were only thinking of his well-being, her words dripping with the same false concern she had wielded for months. But now the mask was gone, the calculation fully revealed. Thomas felt the heat rise in his chest, anger bubbling through the disbelief that still threatened to choke him. He asked them both if this was what they had been circling around all along, if the visits and the pamphlets and the gentle words had been nothing but staging for this moment. Neither of them denied it. Julia gave a little shrug, and Michael's smirk deepened. That was all the answer he needed. He turned away from them, his eyes landing on the staircase, on the hallway where photographs of family vacations still hung, on the mantel where his wife's favorite vase rested. Everything in this house carried the weight of years, of sacrifice, of love, and now it was being claimed by a son who had turned his back on all of it. Michael's voice cut through the silence again, sharper this time, the cruelty undisguised. He told his father it was time to face reality, that he was useless now, that he should find somewhere else to die. The words hit harder than fists, slicing into the last fragile thread of trust Thomas had clung to. His knees nearly buckled, but he refused to let them see him fall. He straightened his back and nodded once, though the storm inside him raged. He began packing that night, each shirt folded with trembling hands, each book placed into the suitcase like a fragment of a life being stripped away. Julia leaned against the doorframe, checking her watch as if his grief were making her late for an appointment. Michael paced the hallway, impatient, restless, eager to step into what he believed was now his domain. When the last bag was zipped shut, Thomas paused, looking around the room that had once been a sanctuary. He saw his wife's photograph on the dresser, her smile frozen in time, and for the first time since her death, he felt something other than grief. He felt fury, sharp and clean, cutting through the haze of loss. They drove him to a budget motel on the edge of town, dropped his suitcases by the curb, and handed him $200 in cash. Julia smiled as if she were doing him a favor. Michael muttered something about independence, about freedom from responsibility, words that twisted into mockery before they even left his lips. Then they left him standing in the parking lot as though he were nothing more than a tenant evicted from a property he had never owned. In that dim motel room, with its peeling wallpaper and thin towels, Thomas sat on the edge of the bed and let the silence press in. For a few hours the disbelief drowned him, the betrayal pressing so hard against his chest he thought it might break him. But beneath the sorrow, beneath the anger, something steadier began to form. His wife had been meticulous with everything she touched. She had made sure the family's affairs were in order, had spoken of protection, of not leaving him vulnerable. Michael's smug certainty didn't match her character. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tight, and whispered into the empty room that he would find out the truth. Whatever game Michael thought he was playing, it was not over. 40 years of sacrifice could not be erased by forged words and cold smiles. The betrayal was complete, and it had cut him deeper than he thought he could bear. But it had also lit a spark that grief alone could not extinguish. As he stared at the cracked ceiling above, his breath steadying, Thomas felt resolve take root. Michael believed he had already won, but he had underestimated the man who had built this life from nothing. Because betrayal was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a reckoning that would leave his son facing consequences he never imagined. And in the days ahead, Thomas would discover just how much his wife had prepared, and just how far he was willing to go to reclaim what was his. Would you like me to continue into that discovery with the lawyer, tying it seamlessly into the next part? The car pulled away and the red taillights vanished into the night, leaving Thomas standing in the gravel lot of the Sunset Inn with 2 suitcases at his feet and a hollow in his chest that felt wider than the sky above him. He bent down, picked up the worn handles, and walked toward the flickering neon sign that buzzed faintly like an insect trapped in a jar. Inside, the lobby smelled of bleach and stale coffee. The clerk didn't look at him twice, just slid a key across the counter and pointed toward the stairs. Room 12. That was all the acknowledgement Thomas received, as though he were not a man, but a passing shadow, a ghost who would be gone by morning. He opened the door to find a room that seemed to sigh with disappointment. The carpet was threadbare, the wallpaper peeling at the seams, and the mattress sagged in the middle like it had carried the weight of too many defeats. He set his bags down and sat on the edge of the bed. The springs groaned beneath him, and for a long moment he stared at the floor, his hands resting on his knees, his breath shallow. The humiliation washed over him in waves. His own son had placed $200 in his hand, like a tip for services rendered, and driven away, without a backward glance. He looked around the room and thought about the house he had just left behind, the home where his wife's laughter had once filled every corner, where her touch lingered on the furniture, where her presence was woven into the very walls. Now it belonged to Michael, claimed without shame, while he sat in a room that smelled faintly of mildew, stripped of dignity. He closed his eyes, but the images came anyway. Julia's watchful stare as he packed, Michael's smirk as he announced the house was his, the sharp cruelty in the words, "Find somewhere else to die." They echoed inside him, each repetition a blade slicing deeper. Hours passed, though time felt meaningless. He switched off the lamp, lay back on the mattress, and stared at the ceiling. The silence was not peace. It was emptiness, a void that swallowed him whole. He thought of the sacrifices he had made, the years of hard labor, the double shifts, the holidays missed, so that Michael could have every chance. He thought of the pride he once felt watching his son walk across the stage at graduation, the tears in his wife's eyes as she squeezed his hand. All of it now seemed like a cruel joke, a story that had led only to this motel room and $200 pressed into his palm, as if his worth could be measured in bills that would barely cover a week's expenses. He pressed his palms to his face, and for the first time in years he allowed himself to weep openly. not just for the betrayal, but for the years he could never get back, for the woman who would never see how wrong their son had become, for the life that had been reduced to a sagging bed and a single bare bulb humming above him. He whispered her name into the darkness, her absence louder than any silence. Yet beneath the despair there was something else, faint but steady. His wife had been meticulous, a planner who left nothing to chance. She had spoken of protection, of making sure he was never left vulnerable. Could it be that Michael's words were lies, that Julia's smirk was built on nothing but arrogance? The thought was small, but it flickered in his mind like the neon sign outside the window. The next morning he forced himself out of bed, his body heavy but his steps deliberate. He walked to the small desk in the corner, pulled open the drawer and found a worn phone book. His fingers traced the pages until he landed on a name he remembered, Whitaker, the family lawyer who had once handled the purchase of their home. He picked up the motel phone, the receiver sticky with years of use, and dialed the number. Each ring felt like a heartbeat pounding in his ears, until finally a calm voice answered. When he explained who he was, there was a pause, then surprise. The lawyer said he had been expecting to hear from Thomas weeks ago, after the reading of the will. The words hit Thomas like a jolt. The reading of the will? He had never been told. Michael had said it all belonged to him, every account, every asset. But the lawyer's voice carried certainty, not confusion. He insisted Thomas come in, that they needed to talk. Thomas hung up the phone and sat still, the air in the room suddenly sharper. A pulse of something other than despair stirred in his chest. Perhaps it was hope, perhaps anger, perhaps both. He gathered his suitcases, straightened his back, and walked out of the motel without looking back. The humiliation of that room, of the $200, of being discarded like an unwanted tenant, would not be the end of his story. As he stepped into the sunlight, his mind returned to the vow he had made in silence the night before. He would not be erased. And soon, very soon, Michael would learn that the father he had cast aside still had a voice, still had strength, and still carried the weight of a truth he was not prepared to face. Because what waited for Thomas in that lawyer's office was not more emptiness, but a revelation that would turn humiliation into fire and despair into a weapon. And when that fire was unleashed, Michael's smirk would vanish forever. Would you like me to continue seamlessly into that lawyer's office revelation, carrying the same sharp, cinematic tone? The morning air was crisp when Thomas stepped out of the motel, his breath visible in the pale light. He clutched the strap of his worn suitcase, though he had left it behind in the room, as if habit made his hands seek weight. The bus ride into town rattled every thought loose inside his head, but one belief settled deeper with each mile. Michael had lied. His wife would never have left him with nothing. She had been too careful, too deliberate in every choice, from balancing grocery lists to managing hospital bills during her illness. If she had prepared a will, it would not have been a weapon against him. The law office was housed in an old brick building downtown, a place Thomas remembered from years before, when he and his wife had signed mortgage papers. The brass nameplate on the door still read Whitaker and Associates, and stepping inside felt like crossing into a space untouched by time. The scent of polished wood and old paper filled the air. Behind the desk, Mr. Whitaker looked up, his wire-rimmed glasses slipping down his nose. His expression shifted from surprise to concern. "Thomas," he said, rising to his feet, "I've been wondering when you'd come. I tried calling, but your son told me you were traveling." Thomas froze, the lie striking him as cruelly as the night at the house. "Traveling?" he repeated, his voice low. Whitaker frowned, motioning him to sit. "Yes, after the reading of the will. Michael insisted you were too distraught to handle it yourself. He opened a drawer and withdrew a thick folder, his movements steady, deliberate. He laid the documents on the desk, his hands precise as he flipped to the final page. But you should have been here. This was meant for you. Thomas leaned forward, his chest tight, as the lawyer adjusted his glasses and began to read. The words felt like a hammer shattering the coffin Michael had nailed shut around him. His late wife had left the house, every room and brick of it, to him. She had left him 70% of the financial assets, investments, and accounts, valued at $22 million. For a long moment, Thomas couldn't speak. Relief swept through him, powerful and dizzying, but alongside it came a flood of anger so sharp it made his vision blur. Michael had stood in his living room, looked him in the eye, and claimed everything was his. He had cast his father out with lies, smug and certain, while the truth was here, ink on paper, signed and sealed, by the woman who had known them both better than anyone. Whitaker's voice grew firmer. "Your son told you otherwise, didn't he?" Thomas nodded, unable to form words. The lawyer's expression darkened. "Then he has committed fraud. This will is valid, notarized 6 months before her passing. And there's more." He flipped another page, his finger tracing a clause Thomas hadn't noticed. "The remainder of the assets, designated for Michael, were contingent on how he treated you after her death. If he failed to show respect and dignity, the full amount reverts to you." Thomas sat back in the chair, his breath catching. He had been humiliated, discarded, told to find somewhere else to die. Michael had not only failed the test, he had destroyed his own inheritance with his cruelty. The weight in Thomas's chest shifted, no longer heavy with despair, but pulsing with something fierce. His wife had known. Somehow she had anticipated what might happen, had placed this safeguard like a hidden blade waiting to be revealed. She had trusted the truth to outlive her, and now it had. Whitaker leaned forward, his voice low. "Every account your son believes he controls will be frozen by this afternoon. The utilities he transferred into his name will be reversed. His access ends today." For the first time in weeks, Thomas felt his spine straighten. He was no longer a discarded old man sitting in a motel. He was the rightful heir to everything he and his wife had built, and the law stood with him. The lawyer gathered papers, making calls to the banks and drafting instructions. Thomas sat quietly, watching, his mind a storm. He thought of Michael's smug grin, of Julia's watchful eyes, of the way they had stood in his home, as if he were already dead. He imagined their faces when the cards collapsed, when the credit cards were declined, when the accounts vanished, when the house was no longer theirs to claim. The thought didn't bring joy, it brought justice. By late afternoon, the calls had been made, the orders signed. Thomas left the office carrying copies of the will, the papers heavy in his hands, but light in his heart. He walked down the street with the steady stride of a man reclaimed, the sun warming his shoulders. For the first time since his wife's death, he felt her presence not as absence, but as strength, as though she had guided him to this moment. As the bus carried him back toward the motel, he looked out at the passing streets, each turn bringing him closer, not to despair, but to reckoning. Michael thought he had stripped his father of everything. He thought the story was finished. But the truth had emerged, and it was sharper than any blade. And soon, very soon, Michael would learn that the man he had cast aside was about to return, not broken, not defeated, but armed with $22 million and the unshakable weight of justice. Would you like me to continue directly into the confrontation with Michael, carrying the same cinematic tension? The office grew colder as Mr. Whitaker's voice settled into silence, the weight of his words pressing into the air like a verdict. Thomas sat motionless, his hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly his knuckles ached. The claws on the page blurred and sharpened again as he read it himself. The elegant handwriting of his late wife's signature, anchoring every letter. His son's inheritance had been conditional, tied to a single expectation: respect. And by discarding him like trash, by driving him to a cheap motel with $200 in his pocket, Michael had sealed his own fate. The $22 million was his now, all of it, every account, every brick of the house, every trace of the life his wife had protected with such foresight. A slow realization washed through him, not relief exactly, not triumph, but something deeper, steadier, a vindication that burned hotter than anger. His wife had seen this coming. Somehow, she had known their son's hunger for control, had anticipated the cruelty that grief would unleash, and she had placed this safeguard in the will, like a sword hidden in plain sight. She had not left Thomas defenseless. Even in death, she had fought for him. Whitaker adjusted his glasses, his voice measured but laced with quiet satisfaction. Michael has made his choice. The moment he treated you without dignity, the inheritance reverted. He triggered his own downfall. He leaned back in his chair, studying Thomas carefully. The law's clear. You are now the sole heir. He has nothing. The words sank in, and Thomas felt his chest rise with a breath that didn't catch this time. For weeks he had carried the weight of humiliation, the sting of betrayal, the suffocating emptiness of loss. Now those feelings shifted, transforming into something sharper, stronger. He was not the discarded man his son had imagined. He was not weak, not powerless. He had been underestimated, and now the truth stood like a fortress behind him. Outside the window, the city moved on, oblivious, cars weaving through traffic, strangers crossing streets. But inside that office, a storm was brewing. Michael thought he had won. He thought he had erased his father with forged smiles and cruel words. He had no idea that the ground beneath him had already collapsed. Whitaker began drafting letters, calling banks, issuing instructions with the precision of a man used to battle. Thomas watched in silence, his eyes fixed on the documents spread across the desk. Every line was a nail in Michael's coffin, every signature a chain pulling him deeper into the consequences of his own arrogance. By the time Thomas stepped out of the office, the air smelled different, sharper, alive. He carried copies of the will under his arm. The pages stiff in their folder, heavy with truth. The streets stretched before him, not as paths of exile, but as avenues leading him back to the life that had been stolen. He boarded the bus with a steady step, the faces around him blurred, unimportant. What mattered was the moment that was coming, the moment his son would discover that everything he thought he controlled was gone. He imagined the scene unfolding. Credit cards declined at a restaurant, Julia's face paling as the waiter returned embarrassed, utility bills bouncing back, bank accounts frozen, contractors turning away when payments failed. He pictured Michael pacing, his voice rising in panic, Julia whispering that there must be some mistake. And then the phone call, Michael's number flashing on the screen, the voice frantic, desperate, begging for answers. Thomas's lips tightened into the ghost of a smile at the thought. He would answer, but it would not be with the weakness they expected. It would be with truth sharp enough to cut. Back at the motel, he laid the documents on the small table beneath the dim lamp. The sagging bed no longer felt like defeat. It was a temporary stop, nothing more. His true home was waiting, and with it, justice that could not be undone. He poured himself a glass of water from the chip pitcher, raised it slightly toward the ceiling as if to his wife, and whispered a thank you. She had known. She had protected him even from beyond the grave. The phone on the nightstand buzzed later that evening. He stared at the screen, at the name glowing there, Michael. He let it ring once, twice, 3 times before picking it up. His son's voice crashed through the line, already laced with panic. "Dad, something's wrong. The accounts, they're frozen. Julia's card got declined. What's happening?" Thomas sat back, his voice calm, deliberate. "What's happening is the truth, Michael. The will was clear. Your mother left everything to me. You were given a condition. You failed it." There was silence, then a stammered protest, excuses spilling out like broken glass. He didn't listen. He cut his son off, his tone final. "You told me to find somewhere else to die. Instead, I found the truth, and it cost you $22 million. He hung up before Michael could reply, the sound of the click like a door slamming shut on years of sacrifice unreturned. The nights stretched on, but Thomas did not feel the familiar weight of despair. Instead, he felt something new. Power. Not the crude kind measured in dollars, but the quiet power of justice, of knowing the balance had shifted. The man they had tried to erase was no longer invisible. He was back, standing taller than before, holding every card. He lay down on the bed, the thin mattress creaking beneath him, and closed his eyes. Sleep came easier now. Not because the pain was gone, but because it had been transformed. Tomorrow he would return to the house, not as a guest, not as a shadow, but as the rightful owner. Tomorrow Michael would see what betrayal costs. And beyond tomorrow there was more. Choices to be made, a legacy to protect. Perhaps even a chance to turn his fury into something larger than revenge. Because this was not just about money. It was about dignity reclaimed, justice delivered, and a father who refused to be erased. And as Thomas drifted into sleep, one thought burned steady in his mind. Michael believed he had won, but the truth had only just begun to unravel. And what came next would shake him to his core. Would you like me to continue seamlessly into that next confrontation scene, where Michael comes face to face with the reality of his downfall? The calls went out one by one, each stroke of Mr. Whitaker's pen and each firm instruction over the phone a domino falling. By mid-afternoon, the machinery of truth was already grinding forward. Accounts that Michael had strutted over like a king collapsed into silence. Access denied. Balances sealed. Credit cards that Julia had flicked onto counters with a smile were rejected with flat beeps and apologetic looks from clerks. Utilities she had smugly transferred into her name were yanked back into suspension pending verification. It took less than a day for the empire of arrogance they had built to implode. At the Sunset Inn, Thomas sat at the small table beneath the weak lamp, the folder of documents open before him. His reflection stared back faintly in the dark glass of the window, and for the first time in days his lips curved into a smile. It wasn't triumph dripping with cruelty, nor revenge poisoned with bitterness. It was a smile carved out of justice, the quiet satisfaction of a man who had been stripped bare, humiliated and abandoned, only to discover he was stronger than they had ever imagined. The humiliation of the sagging mattress, the sting of $200 pressed into his hand like a tip. Those wounds were beginning to scab over. Not because they didn't hurt, but because he was holding the power now. The motel phone buzzed once, twice, then again, a desperate rhythm that echoed in the hollow room. Michael's number glowed on the screen. Thomas let it ring until the final tone cut off. Moments later, it rang again. This time he answered. His son's voice was frantic, jagged with panic. "Dad, listen, there's some kind of mistake. The bank. There's a problem. Julia's card got declined at dinner. The accounts. They're saying everything's frozen. What's happening?" Thomas leaned back, his eyes on the ceiling, his voice steady and unhurried. "What's happening is the truth, Michael. The will was clear. Your mother left everything to me. You were given a chance, a condition. You threw it away. There was a pause, broken only by Michael's quickened breathing. Then came the excuses, tumbling fast, the words colliding with each other. Thomas cut him off, his tone final. "You told me to find somewhere else to die. Instead, I found the law, and it remembered me." He hung up, the click echoing in the silence. He sat there for a moment, feeling the surge in his chest. Not the shaky pounding of despair, but the steady rhythm of resolve. Power wasn't in the millions written on paper, though $22 million now bore his name. Power was in the reversal, in seeing the arrogance stripped away, in knowing that cruelty had met its cost. That evening he imagined Julia at a boutique, trying to hand over a sleek card and being met with a shake of the cashier's head. He pictured Michael calling contractor after contractor, each one refusing to work without payment, his plans for renovations dissolving in a chorus of declined transactions. He didn't need to be there to see it. The image was enough. He stood at the motel window, looking out at the parking lot lit by the neon sign, and raised the glass of water in his hand like a toast. "For you," he whispered to his wife, gone but still guiding him, her foresight stitched into every line of the will. Sleep came easier that night, not because the past had vanished, but because justice had begun to settle into place. He wasn't finished. There was still a reckoning ahead, still words to be spoken face to face. Michael and Julio had built their lives on manipulation, believing Thomas too weak, too grief-stricken, too old to fight back. They were wrong, and when they came to him again, and he knew they would, it would not be as victors looking down at a defeated man. It would be as beggars staring up at the father they had betrayed. The next morning, as sunlight pierced the thin motel curtains, Thomas folded the documents back into their folder and straightened his jacket. He would not stay in this room much longer. The house was his. The accounts were his. And soon he would walk through the door they had forced him from, not as a guest, not as a relic of the past, but as the rightful master of everything they had tried to steal. And when that door closed behind him, Michael would understand what it meant to play games with blood and legacy, because justice was no longer a distant hope. It was here, sharp and undeniable, and Thomas was holding it in his hands. What he didn't know yet was how far desperation would drive his son, or how dangerous people become when the ground beneath them crumbles. And that truth, waiting just beyond the horizon, was about to test him in ways neither wealth nor will could prepare him for. Would you like me to continue directly into that confrontation, where Michael and Julia come crawling back, and Thomas faces them eye to eye? The motel phone buzzed again, the same number flashing across the screen. The digits that once brought birthday calls and hurried holiday wishes now carrying only desperation. Thomas let it ring longer this time, savoring the silence before lifting the receiver. Michael's voice crashed through, unsteady, stripped of its usual confidence. "Dad, please. You have to explain what's happening. The bank is saying the accounts are locked, the utilities are suspended, Julia's card was declined in front of everyone. This has to be a mistake." His words spilled out like a dam breaking, but Thomas sat still, his hands steady, his face calm. The storm inside him had passed. What remained was something sharper, colder, unshakable. He spoke slowly, his tone even, each word falling like a hammer. "No mistake. You lied. You forged. You betrayed. And now you've lost everything." The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. On the other end of the line, Michael's breathing faltered. This was not the broken father he had dismissed at the curb of a budget motel. This was a man who had crawled through humiliation and come out carrying truth like a blade. Michael stammered, scrambling for excuses. He said he was protecting his father from responsibility, from the burden of managing so much. He said Julia had convinced him it was for the best. He said grief made them act too quickly. Thomas closed his eyes, listening, but his expression did not change. The words were smoke, thin and fleeting. He remembered Julia's smirk as she stood by the door, Michael's cold eyes as he handed over $200 like charity. No excuse could erase that. He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower, the tone final. I was your father for 40 years. I gave you everything I had, worked myself raw so you could have opportunities I never dreamed of. And when your mother died, you had a choice. You could have stood beside me. Instead, you threw me out of my own house. That choice has consequences. Michael's protest rose higher, sharper. Dad, you can't do this. You can't take everything. I'm your son. Thomas's hand tightened on the receiver, his jaw set. Being my son was never about blood. It was about respect. You failed that test the moment you told me to die somewhere else. There was a sound on the other end, a gasp or perhaps a sob. Julia's voice cut in faintly, sharp and hurried, whispering words Thomas couldn't make out, but knew were orders disguised as comfort. She had always been the strategist, the one whispering in Michael's ear, but it didn't matter now. The game had ended. Dad, please, let's meet and talk about this, Michael begged, his voice cracking. We can fix it. We can come to an understanding. Thomas straightened, his eyes hard, his tone flat. There is nothing to fix. There is nothing to understand. You made your choice, and now you live with it. He hung up before Michael could reply, the click slicing through the air like a blade severing the last thread that bound them. He sat in the silence that followed, the hum of the neon sign outside the window, the only sound. For the first time in weeks, his chest didn't feel heavy. The grief was still there, sharp and constant, but woven into it now was strength, dignity reclaimed. That night Thomas slept without dreams, and when dawn broke he rose with a clarity he had not felt since before his wife's death. He dressed deliberately, buttoning his shirt with steady hands, and slid the folder of documents into his jacket. It was time to return, not to the motel bed, not to the hollow of humiliation, but to the house that was his by right. The bus ride felt different this time. He sat by the window, watching the streets roll past, his reflection staring back at him. The man in the glass was older, yes, weathered by grief, but he was not broken. He was unyielding. When the bus pulled to a stop near the edge of the neighborhood, he stepped off and walked the last stretch on foot. Each step across the pavement was a drumbeat of resolve. The house came into view, its roofline sharp against the morning sky. He slowed, the sight pulling at something deep inside him. For weeks it had been a place of betrayal, but now it stood waiting, still his, still filled with the echoes of the life he had built. He walked up the drive, the crunch of gravel beneath his shoes the only sound. At the porch, he paused. Through the window, he could see movement, Julia pacing, Michael at the table with his head in his hands. They hadn't expected him. They thought the man they abandoned at a motel would never return. Thomas's lips pressed into a line, his hand steady as he reached for the doorknob. He opened the door, and the silence that followed was louder than a shout. Michael looked up, his eyes wide, his face pale. Julia froze, her expression cracking, the confidence she wore like armor slipping from her face. Thomas stepped inside slowly, his presence filling the room like a shadow stretching across the floor. Neither of them spoke at first. It was Michael who broke the silence, his voice thin. Dad, I was going to call you again. Thomas's reply was quiet, but it carried the weight of a hammer. You already did, and I already answered. The words hung in the air, sharp and final. He moved further into the room, his gaze sweeping across the furniture, the photographs, the walls he had built a life within. This was his house, his legacy, his wife's memory, and they had tried to strip it from him. Michael's voice trembled, desperate. "We can work something out." Thomas turned his eyes on his son, the steel in his gaze unflinching. "There is nothing left to work out. This house is mine. The accounts are mine, and the respect you owed me is gone forever. You chose greed over family. You chose betrayal over loyalty. And now you live with the consequences." Silence filled the room again. Julia looked away, her lips pressed into a thin line. Michael's shoulders slumped, his eyes dropping to the table. Thomas turned, his hand resting on the back of a chair, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to breathe. He had not come for vengeance. He had come for dignity, and he had taken it back. As he walked toward the door, his voice carried one last time, calm and steady. "This is only the beginning, and you haven't seen the rest yet." The door closed behind him, and the silence inside the house cracked wide open, because the confrontation was over, but the reckoning had only just begun. Would you like me to carry this straight into the aftermath, where the collapse of Michael and Julia's world deepens, and Thomas finally steps back into his home as its true master? Thomas stood in the doorway of his house, the same door he had once been forced to leave behind, and let the silence wash over him. It was not the silence of grief or exile this time, but of return. The air smelled faintly of lemon oil, and the old wood floors creaked in the familiar way. Every sound a reminder that this place was his. Not by chance, not by mercy, but by right. He set the folder of documents on the hall table, brushed his hand across the frame that still held a photograph of his wife smiling in the garden, and for the first time since her funeral, the ache in his chest softened. The house was no longer a monument to what he had lost. It was a beginning. He moved slowly through the rooms, touching the edges of furniture, straightening the chair his wife used to favor by the window. He paused at the kitchen, his fingers tracing the counter where she once kneaded dough, her laughter still echoing faintly in the corners. Grief was still there, sharp and heavy, but it was no longer a chain around his neck. It had become a thread woven into strength. The betrayal he had endured had stripped him raw, but it had also left him standing taller than he had in years. When the lawyer's letters had gone through and the accounts were officially his, Thomas sat at the same desk where his wife had once balanced checkbooks and made plans for the future. He opened a notepad and began writing. Not about revenge, not about what Michael and Julia had lost, but about what others like him needed to know. He thought of the men and women he had seen over the years, neighbors and old friends, seniors living quietly and trusting blindly, unaware of how vulnerable they could be. He thought of the motel room, of the humiliation pressed into his palm with $200, and he decided that no one else should face that silence alone. He began outlining the framework of a foundation, a place where seniors could come for guidance, where they could learn to protect themselves from the kind of betrayal that had nearly broken him. He imagined seminars at community centers, workshops at churches, brochures distributed at libraries, all teaching older men and women how to safeguard their assets, how to read the fine print, how to recognize manipulation disguised as love. The inheritance was large enough to fund it, and for the first time, Thomas felt the weight of that $22 million not as money, but as possibility. Word spread quickly in the neighborhood that Thomas had returned. Some came by to offer cautious smiles, unsure of the story, but sensing the shift in him. He accepted their greetings with quiet dignity, not explaining, not needing to. Michael and Julia had vanished from the scene. Their world collapsed, their voices reduced to whispers behind closed doors. Thomas did not chase them, did not linger on what they had lost. His victory was not in their ruin. It was in the fact that he could stand in his own home, unbroken, holding plans for a future that honored not just himself, but every senior who had been silenced by betrayal. Nights in the house became easier. He sat by the window with a lamp glowing beside him, writing letters to local officials about his plans, making lists of names he could call, people he trusted who might help. He wasn't just rebuilding walls and gardens. He was rebuilding his life. Each morning he rose earlier, his steps firmer, his breath deeper. He began tending to the garden again, trimming the rosemary, pruning the lemon tree his wife had loved. The soil felt good in his hands, grounding, reminding him that life grows back, even after storms tear it apart. Michael's voice still echoed in his mind sometimes, sharp and cruel, telling him to find somewhere else to die. But the sting had dulled, transformed into fuel. He knew now that his strength wasn't measured by the respect others gave him, but by the respect he gave himself. His wife had known it too, which was why she had left behind not just money, but safeguards, protections that had carried him through when he thought he was finished. On a late afternoon, he sat on the porch with a glass of water, watching the sun dip low, the sky painted in streaks of gold and crimson. He thought about revenge, about how easy it would have been to gloat, to rub his victory in the faces of the son and daughter-in-law who had tried to erase him. But that wasn't what satisfied him. The best revenge was not in their ruin or in the 22 million sitting safely in accounts now under his name. It was in the simple fact that he was here, breathing, planning, stronger than the betrayal that had nearly consumed him. The foundation took shape quickly. Letters turned into meetings, meetings into commitments. People listened when Thomas spoke, because his voice carried the weight of lived truth, not theory. He told his story plainly, without embellishment, the raw edges left intact. He saw the recognition in the eyes of others, the nods of those who had felt the same fear, the same humiliation. They understood him because he had walked where they stood. His pain became their warning. His survival became their guide. And through it all, the house grew warm again. The rooms filled not with ghosts, but with purpose. Photographs of his wife still hung on the walls, but they no longer mocked him with absence. They reminded him of strength, of foresight, of love that had outlasted death itself. He kept her memory alive, not by clinging to despair, but by building something she would have been proud of. One evening, as the lamp on the porch flickered to life, Thomas wrote the Foundation's mission statement in his notebook. The words came easily, steady and sure. Protect the dignity of those who came before. Guard the legacy they built. Ensure no one is discarded for the sake of greed. He set the pen down, looked out at the twilight, and felt a calm certainty settle into him. The betrayal had been deep, the humiliation cutting, the grief unbearable. But in the ashes of all of it, he had risen. Not as a victim, not as a man crushed by loss, but as one who had reclaimed his dignity and turned it into strength for others. The best revenge wasn't measured in dollars or in punishment. It was in becoming more than what his enemies thought he could be. As the night closed in and the stars blinked awake above the roofline, Thomas leaned back in his chair, his heart steady. Tomorrow would bring more work, more calls, more plans. But tonight, he allowed himself the quiet victory of knowing that he had not just survived betrayal, he had transformed it. And in that transformation lay a truth sharper than any blade. They had tried to erase him, but instead, they had made him unforgettable. Would you like me to now weave all 10 parts together into one seamless cinematic narrative, so the entire story reads as a continuous film-like arc from the hook to the resolution? Life often tests us in the places we least expect, sometimes within our own families. Thomas's story is not only about betrayal, but also about resilience, dignity, and the quiet power of truth. Many older adults know the sting of being underestimated or pushed aside. Yet this story reminds us that age does not erase strength or wisdom. The safeguards his wife left behind symbolize foresight, the importance of preparing for the future, protecting ourselves legally and financially, and ensuring that our voices cannot be silenced by manipulation. More than money, the lesson lies in reclaiming one's self-worth, refusing to be defined by cruelty, and transforming pain into purpose. Thomas chose not to dwell on revenge, but to use his inheritance to protect other seniors from similar abuse, proving that the best justice is living with integrity and leaving behind a legacy of empowerment. For anyone who has felt dismissed, remember, dignity is not something others give. It is something you hold on to and guard fiercely. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from?